have been talking about the science and sorcery of solving problems, and we've been indulging in some just silly escapism together. And so week number one, we went to Egypt. We looked at the time that Egypt was a major world power early in scripture. We talked about how they used their environment to make stronger bricks. Week two, we talked about the Assyrian Empire that rose after Egypt and how they would assault cities from multiple angles, and that they used multiple angles to solve their problems. Then we did dreams in Babylon. We talked about the Babylonian dream interpreters and how they approached their problems with something that approximated an early version of the scientific method. And that brings us to today. We're going to look at boats and Persia. And next week, I think I've settled, we're going to look at monsters and Greece. I mean, there's a lot that can happen between now and next week, but the plan is monsters and Greece. So just as a quick reminder, we're doing all of this through the silly lens of the settler drone. We've imagined that there is another Earth in our solar system and that we have sent robots to settle it for us. They're just like humans. They eat food, they need to sleep, and they're great learners. And so this is the territory that they settled for us on week one. It looks suspiciously like an upside down map of the Egyptian Empire or Egyptian kingdom. This is week two. It looks a lot like Assyria. Week three is Babylon. And so now I know you're all very curious to find out what happened to our settler drones and how much territory they've taken over since last week. And our settler drones have been very, very busy. So when they sent me a map of their territory for this week, it looks like this. This is the biggest territory they've had yet, and it's enormous. But you'll notice it's taken them several tries going back and forth across the land to build up this kind of an empire. But you'll see that there's a little area down here that's kind of outlined in gray. This is a little section that they believe is inhabited by some other unfriendly drones, and they've tried to get over there and take it over, and it has not worked. So they're going to make one final push to try and take this territory. It's really good land. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening there, but they've had a hard time, and so they wanted some of our input. So as they've been looking to expand the territory, they have also, like I said, they've been very busy. There are now 2 million of our drones trying to expand our territory. So they've been multiplying very quickly. And they've learned how to ride horses. They're really good at riding horses. And so this is part of how they've been able to go back and forth so quickly. So isn't that a great picture of our drone on a horse? So our drones, they're riding horses and they're trying to get their horses over to that little area. But they have one major problem. So you see, they're trying to just cross over right there. It's only about only a couple miles they need to travel, but there's something in their way. If you look closely, it's water. It's not very wide. We're talking about maybe a mile or two, but in order for them to cross from this sort of pink territory to the gray territory, they have to cross a mile or 2 miles of water. And remember, these are drones, they're robots. They don't do well with water. They're as water resistant as they can be, but still. And also the horses, they're having a hard time figuring out how to get the horses across. And so unfortunately, the only option they have available is, instead of going this 1 mile, they're going to have to go like this. That is approximately 2,336 miles. And so they really would rather go 1 mile than 2,336, but they can't figure out how to do it. And so again, remember, they're 2 million drones they have to get across that mile of water, and the horses. And they want us to help them figure out how they can advance. They want our help figuring out how to get across that mile of water. Now, one good thing that they shared with me is that they have boats. They have lots of boats. They've got about 1,000 boats. And so the good news is that they've got boats so that they can sail across. And the drones, they like the boats. In fact, they've discovered they can really pack those boats tight, and they can get about 30 drones in one boat. And so they can sail across that mile of water. But the problem is that they only have 1,000 boats. So if you do some math, you'll understand what the issue is. So, oh, this was supposed to wait for me, but it all happen at once. So 1,000 ships and 30 drones, that means it's 30,000 drones every time our ships go from one shore to the other. And so at 2 million drones, that means it's going to take 70 trips. It takes about 17 or 18 minutes to load the drones onto the boat, and then 18 minutes to get them off on the other side. So it's about 35 minutes of load time and 25 minutes of sail time round trip. So that means it's 60 minutes per trip, 70 trips at 60 minutes. That's 70 hours of nonstop sailing, which plus the horses too. Right, we still haven't figured out how to get the horses across. And so once you get to 70 hours, I mean, even if we're making them work 10 or 15-hour days, it's going to be about a week. And so now we have to start factoring in time for them to eat, time for them to sleep, time for them to use the bathroom. And if they're going to eat, we have to then divide our boats, because now boats have to carry food across, and they have to carry supplies like tents and bedding. And so the sailing across is just not going to work the way we want it to. So they decided to build a bridge, right? This is an obvious thing. What you would do is build a bridge. So our drones did that. They built a bridge, and that night there was a crazy storm, and it tore the bridge apart. Not to be deterred, they started over. The next day, they built a second bridge, and again, it collapsed overnight. So they can't seem to build a strong enough bridge, and they're not sure what to do. So this is where we are going to come in, and we are going to help our drones. I would like for you in your breakout rooms to figure out how to tell our drones how to get across the water as quickly as they can. They have 1,000 boats. We have 2 million drones and a whole bunch of horses, and they have to cross 1 mile of water. Or if you can find a quicker way for them to go the 2,300 miles around the sea, that's great too. But we want our drones to be able to get across 1 mile of water, if possible, in under a couple of days. So let's divide up into our breakout rooms and figure out how we can advise our drones to cross the water with 1,000 boats. So Rebecca, can you split us into some breakout rooms? All right, we will see you in a few minutes. Well, so first of all, as we think about how we're going to get our drones across a mile of water, the first question I want to ask is, this is a fairly famous historical story. Does anyone know the answer for sure? Thumbs up if you know the answer for sure. Okay. Yeah, maybe some of us, maybe. Okay. So for those of you who aren't 100% sure what the answer is, what did you come up with? How are you going to get our drones across the water?
So our group had 2 or 3 scenarios.
Okay.
Bob?
Yeah, I thought you go to the newspaper and look for the Moses for Hire ad and bring Moses in. That didn't seem entirely possible or reliable. We talked about turning the boats, rafting a bunch of them together, and turning them into something bigger than just 30 people. So put a bunch of them together and somehow see if we could go across with, like, instead of 30 people at a clip, try 300 at a clip, and put 10 boats together.
Yeah.
We talked about maybe trying to make a raft and somehow make a bigger raft, so big enough to, like the Egyptians used to do, I think. Put the horses on, put everybody on a number of rafts.
Okay.
Then we talked about the way they used to get across the rivers in the States. They'd make these ferries where they'd pull them across for a fee. And that's about it. But the only thing we didn't think about is how we could fly over the river.
Okay.
But if you linked all the boats together and had a bridge attached to the top of them, so they were
Yes.
a floating bridge, so that
Okay.
you could all walk across.
We also
Very nice.
thought maybe if they had enough materials to build the bridge, why didn't they build it stronger? Build a stronger bridge.
Indeed.
Talked
Yes.
about a lot of things and didn't decide on anything.
Okay, great. All right. So what about one of the other rooms? What else? What other thoughts did we come up with?
So
Where's Nancy?
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Nancy. She's the one that thought of it.
Mm,
Are you Nancy? muted?
Unmute,
There you go.
unmute.
Where's Nancy? There she is.
There you go.
Okay, I just said the most important answer of all, and you missed it all. No. I talked about putting the boats end to end. My husband is saying side by side, but it's easy to walk 2 miles, and you could have just put everybody across my boats that were side by side, but across, and you could get a lot of people across quickly. I have not figured out how to get the horses across that.
Keith,
Okay.
what was the math?
Keith?
How many boats could we use?
you got 1,000 boats.
Well, Keith's got the answer.
You know what a mile is, 5,200 and whatever.
So if the boat's 50 feet wide,
No, not 50 feet wide.
you can get 10
Long.
streams of boats across the river. So if it's half of that, 5 streams of boats across the river.
We'll be
Okay.
across in 10 minutes, you know.
There you go. Okay. All right. So Sally Shipley, did I see you had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, our group talked about a lot of different things. We figured that there probably isn't one good answer, that you're going to have to do a number of things. But one of the things we wondered is how deep is the water in this body of water, and is it possible just to take the horses and swim across?
Yeah. Could you ford it?
Yeah, could you ford the river?
Right.
Or whatever the body of water is. We also talked about maybe it would be a good idea to send a smaller contingency across the river to negotiate taking over that land rather than bringing all 2 million people thrown across. But we also thought that prayer for divine intervention to part the water
Sure.
might be something we could put into play too, as well as build a better bridge.
Yes. Very nice. All right. Well, let's go back to our lesson here and see what happened. So while you were in the breakout rooms, Rebecca and I dug into some ancient history books, and we did find that if you turn over our map of our drones once again, it does look suspiciously like a real empire. This is the Persian Empire. And it turns out the Persians were doing something quite similar. The first Persian emperors, particularly Cyrus and Darius, pushed both east and west, but they had a really hard time getting across over here to Greece. And so eventually you get to this emperor named Xerxes. Xerxes is pretty famous. And Xerxes, he had his sights set on this little area over here of Greece, and he decided he was going to be the one to conquer it. He was going to add them to the Persian Empire. But of course, like we saw, it's not as easy as it looks. Whoopsie. Well, there's part of our answer. It's not as easy as it looks because of this mile of water. And so the issue that Xerxes had when he first got to the water, and we'll compress a few Xerxes stories to give you an idea of how his mind was working. As they first got to the water, one story goes that when he was ready to set his ships sailing, the weather was too bad. The storms were just horrible. And so the first thing he did is he looked to divine intervention, just like we talked about. He actually kept a group of sorcerers in his army. And so he brought the sorcerers and he told them to cast a spell to make the weather calm down. And we look back at that through history, think what a ridiculous idea that is, except that when the sorcerers got to the water's edge and they began to cast their spells, the storms ended. And we have this documented in history that they cast their spells and the storms ended. The trick, of course, some of you may have heard me talk about this before. It was a really complicated spell. and it took them 3 days to chant it. But when they were done, it stopped raining. Very strange thing that after 3 days, the rain and the storms happened to stop. Some might even say it had nothing to do with the spell, but the Magi, of course, claimed complete credit for that. They were able to stop it. And as he looked across that mile of water, Xerxes commanded his architects to build a bridge. And so they built a bridge, and that night the storm came back and the bridge was destroyed. So in the morning, he told his architects to try one more time. They did the same thing. They built a bridge, another storm, the bridge was destroyed. So the next morning, Xerxes gathered his architects and had them beheaded, because that's the kind of guy Xerxes was. And then he said he needed to punish not only the architects, because like you said, come on, you guys got to build a better bridge. But not only did he want to punish the architects, he wanted to punish the water itself. So the story goes that Xerxes instructed his soldiers to whip the sea. And so they waded into the water to their knees with whips and began to whip the sea. And once he thought the water had had enough, he called them back and said, now we need to subjugate it completely. To prove that I have conquered it, I would like you to shackle the water. And at this point, you have to imagine they looked at one another and like, what are we supposed to do? But then they looked over at the architects and realized they really didn't want to make Xerxes angry. So they then gathered shackles and cast them into the sea and proclaimed that the sea was now a prisoner of the mighty King Xerxes. So once they had imprisoned the sea, as ridiculous as that may sound, he then gathered what was left of those bridges and a new set of architects and told them they had better build a bridge. And so they took those 1,000 boats, and just like we suggested, they lined them up one next to the other. They anchored them as best they could, and they built a bridge across the boats, kind of a pontoon bridge. And they had to actually build two right next to each other, one for the soldiers and horses and another for food and supplies. And so he actually used his boats to create a floating bridge. And this looked like it was going to work. They started to send the soldiers across. And as we said, if you're only going over, and it depends, no one knows exactly how wide it was 2,500 years ago. Estimates range anywhere from 3/4 of a mile to 2 miles. But it doesn't take a group of soldiers very long to walk across 2 miles. But then they tried to bring the horses. And the horses got about a step onto that bridge. They felt it moving under their feet. They looked to the side and they turned around and wanted nothing to do with walking across the boats. So now they had this additional challenge of getting the horses across. And so they continued, they went back to the architects. And the story goes that Xerxes and his soldiers came up with a way to get even their horses across the bridges. What they did is they took the boats that may have looked something like this. And when they were all done, they had actually built fences along either side. And Xerxes then had his soldiers haul dirt and grass to pave the bridge with dirt and grass. So the horses, when they looked to one side or another, could only see the fencing. And when they looked before them or beneath them, they saw grass or dirt, and the horses were then willing to walk across the bridge. And so Xerxes was actually able to cross the mile or 2 miles of water and march his soldiers into Greece. He was able to solve the problem by taking the boats and using them for a completely different purpose, not to sail his soldiers across, but to float a bridge. Now, as we think about how Xerxes solved this problem, of course, it's good for us to step back for just a moment and look at some of the other ways we have solved problems. We saw the Egyptians found a way to use what was in their environment. We saw the Assyrians who like to attack a problem from multiple angles. We saw the Babylonians who took a systematic approach. And now with the Persians, we find an innovative way to use ordinary tools. They're using boats in a completely different purpose. This is something that they've had for a long time, and they're using it in a new way. And so often when we're trying to solve problems, sometimes the answer is just, it's not a new piece of equipment or a new solution. It's a new way to use an old tool, which is exactly what we've had to do as a church. We've had our computers and we've had our cameras for a long time, but we've never used them quite this way. We've made soup for the soup suppers for years and years and years. we've never filmed it and sent it out by email. Right, we're doing the same thing right now as we're using tools that we've had for a long time in a slightly new way. So as we are going ahead through the whatever remains of this year and this strange time, as we tackle our problems, maybe a good way to do it is to try and use our old tools in a new way. And I'd also like for us to take a second to look at a couple quick Bible passages. So Xerxes is a famous character in history, but he also does appear in scripture. And so Xerxes is famous for his appearances in the book of Esther. So Esther begins, "This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush." So it's from India to Africa. And remember that map we just saw. Xerxes had territory from India to Africa. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. So that was where his capital was. And so those are the opening verses of Esther. If you get out your Bible and flip and look along, or you look at a different translation other than the NIV, you may see a different name. Sometimes his name appears as Ahasuerus. And part of that has to do with the letters that are available in different languages. X is a strange letter, and X, as we know it, doesn't necessarily appear in ancient languages. So you may see a different name. But so Xerxes, if you remember the character of Xerxes, remember that his father and the emperors before him had been trying to get to Greece. And if you think about Xerxes being constantly focused on going over to Greece and conquering that territory they were never able to take over, the rest of the book makes a lot of sense, because Xerxes gets tricked through the rest of the book. And it may be because he's not paying much attention to anything but Greece. And so we go through, we see Esther, and the entire balance of the Bible hangs on Esther at one moment. And as we get to the end, we're told that King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? And so Mordecai is one of the great heroes of the story of Esther, alongside Queen Esther herself. So we do find Xerxes in the Bible, but this story of him crossing the Hellespont is not in scripture. It's one we know from history. And so now let's take a look at sort of our timeline. We began with Egypt, where we see books like Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus through the Chronicles. Here are some of the Bible characters that appear while Egypt is a major world power. We then move to the Assyrian Empire, where we get Kings, Chronicles, Jonah, books like Isaiah and Jonah. We went ahead to the Babylonian Empire. We talked a little bit about Daniel and books like Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, and then characters like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Jeremiah, his friend Baruch. And now as we look at Persia, you find mentions of the Persian Empire in 2nd Chronicles, also in Daniel, that wonderful story of Daniel, some of his interactions with Darius, or the Persian king. But we also see Isaiah talks about Persia a bit, Ezra and Nehemiah as they rebuild the temple. This is while Persia, during the Persian Empire, people were sent back to Israel, and of course Esther, and then a number of the Bible characters that you'll see, including Cyrus, Darius or Darius, and Xerxes. So there we are, sort of in history. But as we prepare to move ahead and get ready for next week, I know we're just a minute over time, but we have to set up a little bit for next week. So remember our empires. We went from Egypt to Assyria to Babylon to Persia. And as we think about what exactly the Persians did after they conquered Greece, there are a couple of really important stories we ought to pay a little bit of attention to. You see, after Xerxes was able to cross this 1 mile of water, the Hellespont, he then was able to take over this northern area. And the next goal was to march south along the coast to Athens. And so you'll see Athens is right down here. And Xerxes wants to take over Athens, but he has a major problem in that you can see this little inlet right where the arrow is pointing. That little inlet along the coast is a strange place where there's a mountain on the west, and the water is on the east, and it starts to narrow, and it narrows and it gets really, really tight. And so Xerxes had a hard time marching all of his troops through there. And as he was trying to march his army, And Xerxes claimed 2 million troops. In fact, at one point he boasted that anytime he stopped his army to water the horses at a river, they would dry it up. They would drink so much. Xerxes claimed to have millions of troops. Others say it was more like 250,000. Whatever it was, Xerxes had a lot of troops. And as he tried to march them through this narrow pass, there's a little city state right over here called Sparta. And the Spartans saw Xerxes coming, and this story might be familiar to you as we get closer and closer. And the Spartans sent 300 of their most powerful warriors right up here to an area called Thermopylae, this narrow pass. And this is where the 300 Spartans held off the hundreds of thousands of Persian troops. And there are movies and comic books and theatrical adaptations. This is a really famous story. But the Spartans were able to hold off the Persian army long enough for the Athenian navy to come around the side, and they were able to then push the Persians back. And so Xerxes ended up heading back east and never was able to take over Greece. That's very important for us because of what's going to happen to us next week. Next week in our settler drones, they're going to head back inland just like Xerxes. And they're actually going to try to push further east, but they're going to encounter a monster when they do so. In fact, that's the word they're going to use. So next week, what is the monster that our drones encounter? This is something that exists in the natural world, but they believe they have come across a monster. Can they survive the battle with this monster? And how are they going to conquer the invincible? I will tell you all of these things next week. It is 7:04 and it is time for us to wrap up. So let's close in prayer. Let's